I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, before we begin this edition of the program, I want to remind you that it is you, the listener, that helps to keep this show going. I don't have any sponsors or advertisers at this time. This show is entirely listener funded, and you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. Your support is going to be needed now more than ever, as the world is in a really crazy place right now. And I suspect I'm going to be releasing a lot of shows in the coming weeks, months, and even the next few years. So with that in mind, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. With that out of the way, we have a really great edition of the show for you today as Victor Pickard, the C. Edwin Baker Professor of Media Policy and Political Economy at the Annenberg School for Communication, University of Pennsylvania, joins us to discuss an article he wrote immediately after the 2024 election entitled "Under Media Oligarchy, Profit and Power Trumped Democracy Once Again." In this conversation, we'll be discussing the 2024 election and our broken media ecosystem in the era of Donald Trump. We'll also be discussing solutions, ways that that broken media ecosystem can potentially be fixed or bettered in the future. All that and much more in the conversation to follow with Victor Pickard. So with that being said, let's get right to it. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm very happy to have on. I've been familiar with his work for a few years now after the fine folks at Project Censored, specifically Mickey Huff, recommended him to me. Professor Victor Pickard is the co-director of the Media Inequality and Change Center at the University of Pennsylvania, where he also teaches media policy and political economy. And he's also the author or editor of a number of books. One that I found particularly interesting and perhaps very useful to this edition of the program was entitled "Democracy Without Journalism, Confronting the Misinformation Society" from 2019. He's also edited a number of titles. How are you doing, Professor Pickard?
I'm doing relatively well, I guess. I'm very pleased to be here. I know you and I have talked about having a conversation for several years now through a pandemic and many different exciting developments. But at last, we're finally speaking. So I'm very excited to dive into our conversation.
So recently you did some election analysis, writing an article entitled "Under Media Oligarchy, Profit and Power Trumped Democracy Once Again." What's your basic view of the media in relation to the 2024 election?
Well, I think it could be answered in relatively succinctly, and then maybe we can, expand on it a bit. But I don't think they did a good job overall. I think, generally speaking, our media institutions did not rise to the occasion, did not protect democracy, did not challenge this autocratic threat. All the things that we learn in school that the fourth estate is supposed to do. It doesn't mean that there weren't some individuals and some news media institutions that tried their best. And in fact, there's this ongoing debate about whether they really have the power any longer to challenge this kind of threat to our democracy. I'm not willing to let them off the hook so easily, but I do think, things are changing. Our media landscape has changed. There's a lot of nuances, a lot of moving parts. But generally speaking, I think that, yes, democracy was once again trumped by commercial imperatives. And in some ways, it wasn't quite as glaringly obvious as it was during earlier Trump campaigns.
How
And I think
so?
so, especially think back to way back to the dark days of 2016 when Trump appeared to have come out of nowhere. He was treated as this media sensation. There was almost no coverage of policy positions. Not that there was a lot of coverage this time around either, but really, I think at that point, and of course, I think it was captured most notoriously by the former CEO of CBS, the now disgraced CEO of CBS, Les Moonves, who said, Trump's campaign may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS. And I just think that phrase spoke volumes as to, all that was wrong about our media system, how at every turn it was more than willing to sacrifice democratic needs for these kind of, profit imperatives. Now I think the same thing was happening this time around. It was just a little more subtle. There was a little less sensationalism. And, I think at least they went through the performance of pretending to care about our democracy. And of course, by this time, we know what to expect with Trump. I think back in 2016, there was a lot of assumptions at that point where, he's just an entertainer. We don't need to take him seriously. And if anything, he's gotten more fascistic in his political rhetoric than he ever was before.
Yeah,
So
he talks a lot more now. He uses that exact term, the enemy within, which is very frightening.
you don't want to hear that phrase in any sort of healthy democratic society, especially when the implication is the enemy within is, members of the media, uh, you know, radical academics, and just people who don't agree with him are all the enemy within. And so I think there was much more. We knew much more what to expect this time. We had more reason to be concerned. And so, given that context, I think it was even more damning that our media did not rise to the challenge.
If we could, I want to talk a little bit about just the type of media, and I mean, I'm specifically talking about legacy media in America, just to clarify. But I feel as if we've been so heavily propagandized in a lot of ways to think that our media system is the best. I remember arguing with a kid in my class once when I was in college a few years back. I've since graduated, but I said, we essentially have a media ecosystem where the big news outlets are controlled by what, five major corporations at this point. And the response I got to that was, well, it's better than Cuba, where it's all state controlled. And I think sometimes people don't look at the problem with having, a corporate controlled legacy media where, there's capitalistic interests. Can you speak to that problem in our society?
Sure. Yeah. So much of my work tries to uncover these kind of, structural roots of our media problems. Many of the problems that we identify that are most visible to us are really symptomatic of these deeper structural pathologies. And I think, one aspect of that, as you suggested, is concentrated ownership, particularly, corporate ownership, or there's a handful of billionaire oligarchs that control vast sectors of our news and information and communication infrastructures. And so I think that all should be part of our analysis. But I think there's even a higher level of analysis looking at the big picture that recognizes that our media system is hyper capitalistic. So, most democracies on the planet have a little bit more of a mixed media system. They have a more robust public media system, for example. And ours in the US is almost entirely commercially driven, privately owned. And I think it's those commercial logics more than anything dictate a lot of, what our media look like. It's not like a smoky back room where, a handful of rich white guys get together and determine, what the masses are going to see or hear or read in their media. Although in some ways that does happen sometimes. At least it would seem so. But I think that it's more accurate or more instructive to look at it through the lens of it's again these profit imperatives that drive so much of our media's behavior. So they're not structurally designed to live up to the democratic expectations that we all learn about in school, that a democracy requires a free and, by implication, a functional press system. And to give one glaring example of this is simply what's happened to our local journalism, right? So oftentimes when people think of the media, they're thinking of, the New York Times, maybe, cable television, some of the big media companies. But really, most of our engagement, at least for the last 100 years or so, has been with local media institutions, and the market has wiped them out. They are no longer commercially viable. And here I'm talking specifically about newspapers. So just to give out a couple concrete numbers, since the early 2000s, we've lost approximately a third of our newspapers. I think it's actually more than a third now, and roughly two-thirds of our newspaper journalists. And the reason why that matters is not even about, the nostalgia for wrestling through broadsheets and getting ink-stained fingers. Very few of us actually read those dead tree versions of the paper anymore. But it's the fact that those newspapers served as the informational feeders for our entire media ecosystem, right? So even today, most of the original news and information that we might find in social media news feeds or various platforms, if you trace back where it came from, it's still coming from those beleaguered local news media institutions, and those are the ones that are just being wiped out as we speak. And we can go into that more, if we want to. But that's one big aspect of, I think, what's ailing our media landscape. And then if we do look at those big media organizations that we were talking about before, oftentimes they're doing very little actual journalism, and they're even more hyper commercialized than other kinds of media institutions. So, we saw what happened in the run up to the elections. We saw how the billionaire owners, the Washington Post and LA Times, got nervous at the last minute and pulled their presidential endorsements. We've seen what Elon Musk has done to what was formerly known as Twitter, now X. He's weaponized it to become this kind of right-wing, amplifier. So there are so many things we can point to that's wrong with our media, but a lot of it does trace back to the ownership and control of those media institutions and the commercial logics that drive them.
Let's talk more about those commercial logics and also just issues like what you've called sane washing of Trump's rhetoric.
Sure. So this was a new term of art that emerged in this last election cycle, which is just another way of talking about how the press typically will normalize and naturalize things that should not be normalized and naturalized. And to tailor this term to Trump, it was really based on some of his more outlandish behavior and some of the crazy things he was saying, and to try to launder it through the media to make it sound like a plausible, rational, normal political position for a major presidential candidate to take. And our media were doing this. I mean, the New York Times in particular was doing a lot of this. Instead of ringing alarm bells and saying, like, this is not normal, this is actually quite dangerous, some of the things that he's talking about, whether it's mass deportation or the tariffs that he's, today it's all in the news about how he's actually going through with some of his crazier economic plans. So, that was a form of what was called sane washing, make it seem sane and normal. But in many ways, our media do that all the time. They try to naturalize and manage the status quo in various subtle ways. And, I just think it became more apparent when they were covering Trump.
Do you think there's also just a problem with uh, how a lot of legacy media institutions cover the election cycle in the sense of it's sort of treated like a horse race. A lot of times we get caught up in, rhetoric or he said, she said, rather than looking at, well, what are the policies at stake here? Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. And I mean, this is just textbook, media critique 101 that our media typically will cover elections as if they were covering a horse race. That's hence why it's called horse race coverage, but basically focused on, who's up, who's down, what are the polls telling us now, what crazy thing did one candidate say about the other, really boil it down to these personality quirks, sometimes, especially when they're female candidates talking about what they're wearing, but really trivializing what should be given serious policy coverage, right? Serious coverage of policy positions and the implications that those positions would have for all of us, for society writ large. And it just really speaks to the lack of a healthy political discourse that, again, I would never say our media are entirely to blame for all this. There's a lot of contributing factors to it, but they deserve a lot of blame. And running up to elections, especially presidential elections, even today, even as we noted earlier, there's a growing analysis that our legacy media don't have as much control over the discourse. Like, why should we even care about this? But they still do a tremendous amount of work around setting the parameters, basically setting the agendas for what is given attention in these campaigns. And so they really set the tone for the broader popular discourse. And so that's why it's disproportionately important that our media do a good job when people are actually paying attention, as they do, at least more so than normal times in the run up to presidential elections. So I think it's fair to say that, again, even though we knew our media were going to do this, and we asked them not to. Jay Rosen, the inveterate media critic, just pleaded for, a year or two before the election, saying, please don't focus on the odds, focus on the stakes. Let's move out of this horse race coverage frame and really talk about what are the stakes for our democratic society. But far too often, our media did not listen to those pleas and reverted back to their typical horse race coverage.
I think this gets to a bigger problem of I think a lot of news media today has become sort of politainment. And,
Yeah.
I've even met some people that will say, well, you're right about, the fourth estate, but it's become so quaint now, where people just don't believe in it anymore. They think that we're just in this age of politainment and there's no way to stop that. And my response to that is, well, you can't really have a healthy functioning democracy if you don't have informed citizens, and we rely on the media to do that. Can you talk about the interaction between a healthy media ecosystem that informs rather than simply just being, pro wrestling style entertainment? Because I think there's a connection between a healthy media ecosystem and democracy.
Absolutely. I think that's a safe assumption to hold. In fact, I feel like if we let go of that, we're really letting go of any hope for any semblance of democratic society in the future. And again, this goes back to Democratic Theory 101, stuff that we learn as children, that, we need to have a press system in order to maintain an informed populace, so that, as and some of this is more idealistic than reality, but it's still an ideal, just as democracy itself is something that we must constantly strive towards. And we need to have an informed electorate so that we can be self-governing, so that we can make good choices in our elections and choosing people to represent us in our government. That's the definition of representative democracy. And of course, we can get into bigger discussions about, different kinds of democracy and whether, maybe that was part of the problem. We need to have a more rich participatory democracy. But at the very least, in the most kind of impoverished, thin sense of what a democratic society is supposed to look like, we must have a viable news media system to keep people informed about what's happening not only in their own backyards, but what their national governments are doing, what people in power are doing. And also, ideally, it will provide a forum for a diverse range of voices and views so that we have this, much vaunted marketplace of ideas. Again, I feel like we could critique and interrogate and pull apart some of these liberal ideals. But I think some of these things we really don't want to jettison. We don't want to throw out the window. And I think it's really important to strive towards that. But as you suggested, far too often, especially our hyper-capitalistic media, really don't want to treat us as engaged citizens. They want to treat us as passive consumers. They want to capture our attention to deliver to the advertisers who pay them, right? So that's what incentivizes what we sometimes call clickbait. Back in the early 1900s, we called it yellow journalism, but it really is this excess of a capitalistic press system that's really providing us with low quality fare, sometimes, making stuff up even, whatever it takes to capture our attention, keep our eyes glued to various screens long enough to sit through advertisements or to at least yield our data, our information for data brokers that will then package that up and sell to advertisers so they can better target us. So these are the logics that's driving so much of our media, whether we're talking about social media or cable television news, or old-fashioned news media outlets. They're basically being driven by this revenue model that's reliant on advertising. And, that's why they're going to really, degrade the quality of the news and information that they're providing us and not treating us as a democratic polity, but again, just as consumers. And I think that's the kind of media. And it's not, there's always this kind of lazy explanation of like, well, they're just giving people what they want, like this is what people want. And that really needs, that needs to be unpacked a little bit. People don't necessarily, just because their eyes are glued to this stuff doesn't mean if they were given, alternatives, they wouldn't also want like actual high quality news and information. And it's important to point out that audiences are cultivated over time, right? So if you're constantly, you know, providing them with stuff that makes them angry or makes them, scared or whatever, it's like you start whipping up a frenzy, you start developing a kind of audience for that. And here I'm thinking of Fox News in particular, which, over years they cultivate those audiences. It took hundreds of millions of dollars of Rupert Murdoch's investments to actually make Fox News a profitable enterprise, right? So I feel like we also need to pay attention to how audiences are constructed and structured over time. And that also starts to give us a sense of like what we need to do to get out of this mess.
Yeah, I wanted to talk more about solutions, and in particular, um, what do you think about the idea of public financing when it comes to media? And what are some misconceptions people may have about that?
Well, there's as you might imagine, a lot of knee-jerk reactions to any idea, any notion of, publicly subsidizing our media system. When Americans hear that, they drop into fetal positions. This sounds like antithetical to core American freedoms. But in fact, if you know American history, you know that media subsidies are as American as apple pie, going back to the early postal system, which was essentially a newspaper delivery infrastructure. Up and well into the 1800s, 95% of the weight of the press wasn't writing, letters written home to mom. It was actually newspapers. The postal system was like the internet of the 1800s. This is how they delivered news and information, disseminated news and information to far-flung communities across the country, and that was heavily subsidized. so that newspapers were basically disseminated almost for free. And in today's revenue, it would be equivalent to tens of billions of dollars that was being used to subsidize the dissemination of news and information. So, that is something that we need to remember, that it's really a libertarian fantasy to suggest that government should never be involved in our media system. Government's always involved in our media system. It's really a question of how it should be involved. The government was involved in creating telephony and the telegraph and early broadcasting, which is massively subsidized. The internet itself was massively subsidized, came out of, public money, not private money,
Yeah, a
private
lot of it
interest.
came out of like government funded research and development. Yeah.
Absolutely. Both, I mean, some of it through military, some of it through, research, educational institutions. But the early creation of the internet was was basically socialism. I mean, it was publicly financed to create a public good that was then later privatized. So if we know this history, it should disabuse us a little bit of some of our knee-jerk concerns. The last point I'll make on that front before we'll turn to actual real concerns that we should have about government financing our media. But if you look internationally, the strongest democracies on the planet also have the strongest public broadcasting systems. And in fact, I did a study with my co-author Tim Neff, where we looked at 33 countries around the world, and we were using data from this raging left-wing organization known as The Economist. Of course, I'm being facetious. It's a very mainstream, um, if anything, conservative institution, but they put out what's known as the Democracy Index, where they judge the health of democratic countries around the world. And won't keep your listeners in suspense. The U.S. has qualified as a flawed democracy for many years now. But using this data, we found that in these 33 countries, again, the strongest democracies had the strongest public broadcasting systems. And it shows at the very least that if you publicly fund a media system, it's not a slippery slope into totalitarianism, right? Now, there are some cautionary tales, and I do think we should always be concerned about, potentials for state capture of our public media. So if we look at Hungary, we look at Turkey, we look at what happened in Poland a number of years back, these were all, where you saw severe democratic backsliding. And one of the things that happened was that those governments tried to take over or wield, undue influence over the public broadcasting system. So that is something that we have to be very careful doesn't happen. And indeed, during the first Trump administration, we saw what he tried to do with Voice of America, right? So, according to recent reports, I'm not as concerned about him trying to take over public media, but they're trying to defund what's left of our public financing of our public broadcasting system. And to be clear, we don't actually subsidize our public media very well. In fact, it's a misnomer to even call it public media. The American public broadcasting is primarily privately financed. But nonetheless, we still spend, it comes out to about $1.50 per person per year towards our public media. Compare that to what the Brits pay for the BBC. They spend about $100 per person per year, and other European countries spend even more than that. But if the Trump administration were to phase that out, that would be a devastating blow against our public broadcasting. So all this together, at the very least, we should not be freaked out by the idea of publicly financing our media. There's a way to do it democratically to maintain, independence. Although, I do think in the next few years under Trump, the chances of us being able to do that are pretty slim at the national level. I think we're going to have to focus more at the state and local levels to do any kind of publicly financing of local journalism.
I'm glad you mentioned the BBC there because I've had that debate with people. People will say to me, "Oh, well, that's like run by the government," and I'm like, I mean, I don't think the BBC is exactly like, say, a state-owned outlet in Iran or Russia. I mean, it's a very different animal, and I think people need to understand that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And of course, any kind of romanticism I harbored towards the BBC has largely been beaten out of me by my British friends who will talk about how, they are somewhat elitist and,
Oh
they're a
yeah,
little,
there's definitely criticisms I have too.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, right, exactly. So we need to be clear about that. But when I hear about these problems, I think I wish we had those problems in the United States. Like that's nothing. Still, the BBC does a tremendous job in covering a lot of issues and puts anything we have in the States to shame, and they're well funded. So whenever I look at the BBC's problems, I see those as fixable problems. We can democratize it, but they actually have the resources to do a fairly good job. And we designed our public media from the get-go to be relatively economically and politically weak. And again, those are structural problems that can be fixed. That's not inevitable that that's how our public media needs to look like. And that's why in a lot of my work, I float these more kind of ambitious, even utopian plans for building out an entirely new public media system that I think ultimately is something we're going to have to do if we're going to have any sort of, especially local journalism, which the market will never support. There is no commercial future for a lot of the kinds of journalism that we actually need to have a healthy democratic society. So we're going to have to find some kind of public model to do that. But again, one that I would argue must be radically democratized, devolved down to the local level so that you have local ownership and control. We can get into some more of those things.
But I was going to
But
say, I think the important thing is people have to recognize the difference between a media ecosystem that has public funding and one that's like, I think a lot of people when they hear public funding, they think, oh, that means everything's controlled by the government.
right.
And I don't think that necessarily has to be the case. I think you can have journalism and media for the public good that doesn't necessarily say, oh, we're just going to give this administration a pass.
You're absolutely right. I mean, that actually was the logic behind the postal system that I was describing earlier, that it was meant to be ideologically and content neutral, right? Now, there are some historical exceptions to this, but generally speaking, the post system, it didn't matter what kind of newspaper was being distributed. It didn't matter what kind of pamphlet was being distributed. They were treated equally as they went through the post, right? And that's the way any sort of public media system should operate. No government, no central power should be dictating what views get funding and what views don't. But it should be guaranteeing, there should be a federal guarantee that we all have access to a baseline level of news and information, especially when the market is not providing that, as we see so clearly today. So that should be seen. We should see this as an affirmative duty that our government has to guarantee access to a robust and rich and diverse news media system. And it's
And
going to take.
also, it's we the citizenry are paying into making that system better,
That's
so
right.
we're getting something back from it. Yeah.
Absolutely. That should be part of the social contract, right? It is our media. Sometimes I draw the analogy with our public education system for all of its many flaws. It doesn't matter where you live, you're supposed to have access to public education, right? And you would never let that go away simply if, students weren't paying enough money. Now, we have a woefully underfunded public education system, and it's designed poorly, but we still have this like assumption that is like everyone, all members of society should have access to education, right? And I think that's the way we should be treating our media. And exactly as you say, we should see it as ours, right? We all pay into it and we all should derive benefit from it.
You said that you had some more ambitious ideas about how we could reform the media ecosystem. Maybe you could talk about that a bit.
Sure. So, I mean, some of these ideas we've already sort of hinted at, already sort of implied, if not outright stated, but I'll just underscore a point that I made, which is I think the evidence is incontrovertible at this point. I think it's overwhelming that there is no market, there is no business model that is going to support the level of journalism that we need to maintain a healthy democratic society. We're seeing news deserts spread across the country where tens of millions of Americans lack access to any local news media whatsoever. And that's just simply very dangerous for any notion of maintaining a democratic society. So if we're serious about making sure that there is a free press in our society, we're going to have to publicly finance a system, since it will never be, even the nonprofit model, which I think we are kind of living through this new golden age of nonprofit journalism, of experimentation with various kinds of nonprofit reporting, which I think is fantastic. And we can point to all kinds of exciting examples of that, but that's not a systemic fix to this news deserts problem. You're not going to have nonprofit newsrooms pop up in every far-flung place. So the only kind of model that is really driven by this universal service logic that tries to live up to that is a public model. Even our public broadcasting system today, for all of its many flaws, reaches 98% of the American population, right? So that is a kind of universal service model that only a public model can truly strive for. Nonprofit outlets are still dependent on private capital. They're still dependent on foundations and rich benefactors or people who are willing to pay, who tend to be in better resourced areas. So this public model, what I call for in my work, and you mentioned my last book, Democracy Without Journalism. I end on this kind of utopian scheme, which is what I refer to as a public media center, where in every community across the country, again, it is federally guaranteed, but locally owned and controlled, you have a community newsroom that looks like the people it serves. It's actually comprised of local residents who create their own media. And these public media centers, which could be housed in perhaps post offices or public libraries or public broadcasting stations. We could leverage this already existing public infrastructure, but these spaces would serve as multimedia hubs where you would have, citizen journalists producing news media on a regular basis. You'd have low power FM radio. You'd have community internet services, whether were wireless or wireline broadband services. So you could imagine where, you can provide for the information communication needs of local residents through these public media centers. And just to show that this isn't entirely pie in the sky, there actually is an already existing model that does this in the middle of the cornfields in Urbana-Champaign, where I did my PhD at the University of Illinois. Some media activists almost 20 years ago bought the downtown Urbana post office and set up a monthly newspaper, a news website, a low power FM radio station. They provided community wireless internet services, all within this beautiful building in the middle of Urbana. So, this is like my prototype when I'm thinking of, and by the way, this was the Urbana-Champaign Independent Media Center, which was part of an earlier model that I write about. I actually did my master's thesis on this, which at its height had, scores of independent media centers around the world. The one that's in downtown Urbana is one of the last existing independent media centers, but it just shows you that this impulse has been there. It's something that we could try to recover and build upon.
I wanted to mention that because I saw that you were interviewed for a piece on Indymedia, which when I was in my teens and even younger, I really relied on websites like indymedia.org. And it seems like the landscape has changed so much since that era of the early 2000s. What are the main factors that led to, I guess, Indymedia's, I guess it feels like there's been a stagnation. Maybe I'm wrong about that.
No, you're absolutely right. And to be clear, because sometimes indie media is used as kind of a generic catch-all term, but this was a particular model that we're talking about. It's called the Independent Media Center, IMC. The first one was founded in November 1999. So we're coming up late November, I think November 30th. So we're coming up to its 25th anniversary, which is why Columbia Journalism Review did a recent piece on this, which you just noted I was interviewed for. but it was founded in Seattle during the WTO protests. And it was really created to provide news coverage of the activists who were involved in the global justice movement, but also the issues that were important to not just activists, but to all of us that weren't being covered in our mainstream media. And as a kind of proto community news blog, because at that point, like anyone could upload, anyone who had internet access could upload a news story onto these websites through the open newswire. So it was quite radical for its time. And it was open source software, so this whole design could be easily replicated in various places. And wherever you saw a major protest, you would see an independent media center pop up. And but not just in major cities and major protests. You had one, as I noted, in the middle of the cornfields in Urbana-Champaign, and you had them all across 6 continents at its height. And so, it was really this sprawling global network that would exchange. They were all interconnected, so they would syndicate and exchange news stories across news sites. And you're absolutely right. It played such a core role, a central role within this kind of emergent progressive media ecosystem. It got eclipsed somewhat technologically because you had the blogosphere that rose up and then later social media. But a real shift that happened as we moved away. I'll say one other fundamental constraint with the Indymedia model was that it was almost entirely dependent on volunteer labor, right? It was like volunteer activism. And I think, that's why what I'm calling for with public media centers, it would be the same exact model, except people would be paid. You'd have some like full-time employees whose job it was to do this media work on a regular basis. And I think that would be the main difference. But also what we lost as we moved to social media was that then you were moving to this commercial platform, right? And as we're seeing today, increasingly, Facebook deplatforms news media altogether. We see what's happened to Twitter. So whenever we're relying on these commercial social media platforms, they're being driven by a different kind of logic. They're algorithmically biased against activists in many ways, especially progressive activists, against news media in general. Not treating us as engaged. I mean, they're happy when we're exchanging like, cat photos, but not, they don't want us talking politics on Facebook. And that's not to be conspiratorial. It's just like that's their business model, right? That's not, that's not what they want to pay for. So long way of saying we lost something special with the demise, if we want to call it that, of the earlier indie media model. And I do think there's aspects of that that's worth recovering.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's been organizations that have tried to, in ways, take up some of what was left behind by indie media. But, even something like Unicorn Riot, which is a good organization that covers, all the Black Lives Matter protests, the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. They've exposed a lot of, I mean, they were the best coverage of Unite the Right. Uh, and
Mhm.
that rally in Charlottesville is what I'm referring to there. But
Right.
even they're stuck in that sort of 501(c)(3) model. And I think what you're saying is we even need to get beyond that. It's bigger than just the nonprofits.
You're right. I mean, again, as we were talking about earlier, there is an amazing proliferation of these nonprofit funded outlets that are doing fantastic work. I'm also thinking of like Outlier Media in Detroit or City Bureau in Chicago. They're doing hard-hitting, grassroots-driven, media coverage, and that's something to be celebrated. But it's true if you look at what's funding those models, they're very reliant on foundations. Many of the people involved in those foundations are well-meaning people, but we just know that in terms of maintaining a long-term structural plan for providing the news and information we need, the so-called benevolent billionaire model doesn't always pan out for us. Let's leave it at that. And I think that we need to have something that's more permanent, and that's where I feel like, and this public model that I keep going back to. I mean, this could be ideally we would fund an independent trust, right? That is then democratized and devolved down to local levels so that it's not controlled by, any sort of central institution. But we do have to make sure that that money is there, and it will take a massive amount of money to fund the media that we need. So that's something when I talk about these more utopian plans, I'm thinking, this is a long-term political project that will take many years, if not, decades to actualize. But I think we need to have it on our political horizon. Otherwise, we'll never get there. The right has been very successful about having these long-term plans that at first seem outlandish, and then, over time they become commonsensical. Like, of course, that's the way we do things here. So I think those of us on the left need to start working towards those long-term plans
If you
more.
just have a few more minutes, I wanted to ask you,
Sure.
is there a connection between the emergence of news deserts and, I mean, there's even, communities that basically have a ghost newspaper, shadow of its former self newspapers, but we have entire communities where, hundreds of daily and weekly newspapers have been shut down since the 2000s and 2010s. That's what we mean when we say news deserts. I mean, there's just a diminishment of local and community news. Is there a connection between that and the rise of sort of this media oligarchy we have?
Yes, I think so. I mean, sometimes we have to you have to follow. There's a couple points getting from A to B, right? But there's a couple things I'll point out. First, one thing we should be clear about that's somewhat intuitive, but we can now empirically demonstrate this, which is when communities lose their local news media, we now have all these natural experiments where we can see what happens. And sure enough, the social harms are quite blatant, quite glaringly clear, which is people are less likely to vote, less civically engaged, less politically knowledgeable, and yet we see higher levels of corruption, higher levels of extremism. So we see all these kinds of social harms emerge from the collapse of journalism. But what is also happening, the whole concept or the metaphor of a news desert implies that people aren't consuming media in those deserts when anything anything but that is true, which is they're consuming copious amounts of media, except the media is typically coming from national news organizations or Facebook groups or whatever, influencers, podcasts, wherever they're getting their news and information. They're not getting it from reliable local media institutions. And into this vacuum that's been created by the collapse of local journalism is all manner of mis and disinformation. It's also created a landscape that's even more vulnerable to oligarchic capture. And here, not only do we point out like the Jeff Bezoses and Elon Musks and Rupert Murdochs of the world, but also what's happening with the private equity firms and the hedge funds that are swooping in. And the poster child for this is always Alden Global Capital, which is now the second largest newspaper owner. So the second largest publisher in the country is this vulturistic hedge fund that just buys up beleaguered assets such as newspapers and immediately begins selling them off for parts. So sell off, the buildings, the parking lots, the equipment, and of course, laying off all the news workers themselves. So, this is again these kind of opportunistic parasites that settle in, when the news media are dying off. So in that sense, I do think the fact that our fourth estate is withering away creates all these opportunities and incentives for oligarchs. And they get these news institutions for like pocket change. I mean, Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post for $250 million. That's not even half of what he paid for his super yacht. These things are like playthings. These news organizations are playthings for these media oligarchs, these unaccountable billionaires. So, I think all these things are interrelated. With a structurally weak news media system. And of course, we've probably been hearing rumors recently that Elon Musk is looking at MSNBC to buy up. So, this is we're only going to see more of this.
I wanted to ask you briefly about MSNBC because I know, I guess Comcast, I don't know that they're looking to sell it, but they're looking to spin it off. What do you make of that news?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still reading some of the details, so I probably haven't seen much more than you have seen, and many of your listeners have seen. But I would say that, as you note, they are getting ready to spin off Comcast with some other assets into a separate entity, and just typically, historically speaking, media conglomerates will often do this in preparation to sell off or to merge a particular asset with another one, or to trade it, or to how whatever they're going to do with it. It suggests that they're spinning it off into something entirely different, and which suggests that it might be on sale. It hasn't been officially put on sale yet, and it would take presumably months to prepare for any kind of sale, but it certainly could lead to that, and then we have to worry who's going to buy it up. And it's just typical. We often don't think about who owns and controls our media outlets. So, well, wow, MSNBC is this liberal alternative to Fox News. Well, it's owned by Comcast, right? So it's only going to be as liberal as long as it's making money for Comcast. And
Yeah, I
uh,
was gonna say it was interesting. One of the articles I read, I guess Comcast said something along the lines of, well, we need ratings, and they said part of their strategy would be putting Rachel Maddow on different shows because she's quote unquote ratings Viagra. And what I found interesting was like Comcast is saying we don't really care about all this politics stuff. It's just a matter of the ratings.
Oh, yeah, no question. I mean, that is rate, and of course, ratings is not just a popularity contest. It's what translates directly to revenue, right? And so this is all an economic calculus for Comcast, this goes back to, we've come full circle, but the early part of our conversation, I was saying how these commercial logics, more than anything, dictates what lives and what dies in our media system. And so, sure, they're going to give us, it's like cherry Coke, they're going to give us that flavor. They're going to give us the liberal flavor of our media, as long as it's not too threatening. It's like it has to stay within certain bounds and not question certain assumptions. But they're willing to do that as long as it's a moneymaker. But as soon as it ceases to be a moneymaker, then they'll cut that loose, as quickly as they want.
I'll let you get going, but in closing here, I want to get your final thoughts on the state of the media ecosystem and its relationship again to the rise of Trump.
Sure. So, I do think that, again, there are many factors that contribute to the rise of Trump. So I would never go on the record, and I don't want to ever be misinterpreted of saying it's entirely the media's fault. But media are an important piece, an important component of that toxic mix that delivers people like Trump, and I think Trump is just like a walking a money making machine for many of our media. He's inherently controversial. He creates conflict with every utterance, and so it plays right into this kind of sensationalistic media template where even people who pretend, are purportedly anti-Trump in our media, even as they're, resisting Trump in our media, they're still making money for their corporate owners. And so there are very little incentives within our entire commercial media system to really give the kind of, true resistance against Trump and Trump's politics that we need as a democratic society. And people who are doing actual journalists, and they're doing God's work. I don't want to ever suggest that, we don't need these journalists, but they're the ones that are going to be targeted. They're not only the enemy within, they're the enemy of the people, as Trump often said. And I'm worried. I mean, I think we all need to rally around those few journalists that are left, that are out there, that are really trying to hold power to account. They're really trying to scrutinize Trump, and to really, expose all the things that he and his supporters are doing, his cronies are doing. So, that's not a very cheerful picture. But to just end on a slightly more cheerful note, I do think that these kinds of moments really bring clarity to the political economic relationships behind all of our institutions, but especially our media institutions. And I think people are sensitized, they're aware, they're scrutinizing our media in ways that we rarely see. I think especially among young people today, they don't succumb to these kind of market fundamentalist assumptions that, the last couple generations have. And so I think we can dare to dream that we will ultimately create something much better in the future. And we just have to keep working towards that goal.
Thank you again, Victor Pickard, for coming on Parallax Views.
Thanks so much for having me. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, if you appreciate the work here I do at Parallax Views, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. If nothing else, if we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.